the verses that we read today, there's such a powerful question for us that really, as we kind of get rolling in the new year here, maybe is a very clarifying thing for us to think about in how we are going to interact with the year to come. Maybe that's too much. Maybe the year to come is too big of a bite because the year is about stacking day after day in a certain direction. So maybe we'll just talk about the way that we answer this question has a lot to do with the way that we face this day and this week. And so as I thought about that, I thought about how we come to turning points in our lives. You ever had a major turning point in your life? You know what that feels like maybe what you realize is in the moment you didn't realize it was a turning point. It just felt like I'll just do this. But it turns out it was a really, really big deal. It's not that moment changes everything and everything falls into place and moves on, but I can think of a lot of them in my life where looking back on them, I can see that had a major impact and a major effect on the direction and the pathways that my life took. Doesn't mean that there weren't twists and turns along the way, but I can see that those moments were very, very significant. I can think about a 12-year-old me going up to the pastor of our little church, our little country church, because they were having a preaching contest on Sunday night. And the pastor was inviting any men who wanted to kind of try their hand at a 15-minute message on a Sunday night to come up and just let him know. And I thought, that doesn't sound hard. I can do that. At this point in my young life, I had heard literally hundreds of sermons. So I was like, what's the big deal? I'll do that. And I remember the pastor looking at me and he said to me, Mark, are you sure you want to do this? You realize you're going to be in front of everyone at church. And I was like, yeah, that's what preaching is, right? I know a lot of Bible stuff, so I can preach, I can do just what and I remember not thinking that was a big deal, and everybody was like, oh, wow, look at this young kid, and I was like, what's the big deal? Looking back on it, it was a response that I took to something God had put in me, and it was a response that began step by step to lead me on a path to what God had for me in my life. I remember when I was deciding where I would go to college, and there were some factors that went into that. But for me, it was a very, very clear thing about where I was going to go to college. And I thought that was about the type of stuff that I would study and the nature of the school and even the facilities of the school. Turns out it was much bigger than that. Turns out it was about where I was going to meet the most important person in my life outside of Jesus, my wife. And that blessing that God gave me. And so didn't even realize that's what it was going to be. And yet it was a turning point in my life. I know there are some spots in my life where the turning point wasn't so light or so easy. Moments in life when things were so painful, so unjust, so hard, so stressful, that I had to deliberately decide how I was going to respond to that. And in each of those moments, now looking back on some of them, they seem so small, but in that moment, they seemed so overwhelming. But the way that I chose to respond to them set a direction in my life for how I'm going to respond to moments like this. Today, the question that Pharaoh asks, I think, is a question that is a crossroad for us in our life. Maybe one of the biggest crossroads you'll ever face is the question we hear from him today, which is just this. It's the title of our message today. Who is the Lord? We'll see that this moment of decision that Pharaoh has, that God puts in front of him, has very large consequences for Egypt and for Pharaoh. In the weeks to come, in the months to come, we're going to read the story that is the fallout from this moment with Pharaoh and with the Lord. I can't think of a bigger question that we face on a regular basis, on a daily basis, than how we answer this question: who is the Lord? Who is God? It changes everything, not what we theoretically think about it, but what we actually viscerally believe about who God is. And how that storms into the decisions and the moments of our life because of the picture we have of God. Is God someone who is engaged in my life? Or is God someone who is far away and uninterested? Some of us even are at the place where, is God even real? Or is this just a wishful thinking of mankind looking for deeper purpose and meaning in life? But I think as believers, even if you come to the conclusion that God is who he says he is, and Jesus is who he says he is, and he's your Savior and he's your Redeemer, day by day you still answer this question, who is the Lord? Practical, up close and personal, rubber meets the road kind of ways. Is God our Creator, someone who has real and meaningful purpose for us? Or did God just make us to chase after what we can do, what we can accomplish, our talents, our abilities, what other people think of us, and always hoping that we'll have something big enough to feel like significance is ours? What do we believe about God? Is God the kind of Savior who actually engages in the parts of life that are painful and unfair? Or is that an evidence that he is absent, that he's left us on our own to deal with traumas and their fallout? What do we believe about who God is? Does God know the way? Does God have the answers for your life? And will he tell me? Sometimes the two of those don't always go together in people, because sometimes people believe, yeah, God knows the way, but he doesn't want to tell me. That says something about who you think God is. And it directs how you pray and how you make decisions and the hope that you have. If you believe that God has answers but won't share them with you, that influences your relationship with God. Is God someone who is strong enough and good enough and just enough that I can afford to be filled with hope, patient, kind, gentle, good, even when I don't get it back? Is God someone big enough and good enough for that? Who is the Lord? Maybe today you're sitting here and you're far away from God, and asking yourself this question, who is the Lord, is very much in the same way that Pharaoh asks it. Is God real? Does he care about me? Should I get to know him? Does it matter? Maybe you're someone who's already a believer, but in your life, God has shifted to the background. All of the things on your to-do list, all of the agendas of your life have kind of taken over. You're so busy and you're so full and you're so sure of all the ambitions you have that God has kind of taken the background spot in your life. And you're wondering where your hope went, and you're wondering where your strength went, and you're wondering where your peace went, and you're wondering where your joy went. Who is the Lord? Maybe life has gone off the rails and you're really being challenged about who you believe God is, because everything in your life is chaos and painful. Is God really faithful? Am I a fool to trust him? Will he walk with me through the valley of the shadow of death or not? Maybe you're someone who's very aware of your limitations and your vulnerabilities. You know that you can't control your life, and that freaks you out. Does it mean that you need to worry and stress all the time? Or is God present enough and powerful enough and good enough to be your peace and your security and your endurance? Who is the Lord? This is more than a theoretical question where some catechism can give you the right answer to reflect back. This is a very practical question. It is a response in a relationship to someone who is real, not someone you can make up or form into whatever you want him to be. It is a God who is God. And he has shown us who he is, and we get to respond to that one way or the other. The story we read here, the story we're in the middle of, asks this question and really sets up the coming events, which are probably more famous than this conversation, the 10 plagues of Egypt and the Exodus, the parting of the Red Sea and all of that. But the viewpoint that Pharaoh takes in this conversation is one that many people take. Why should I believe there's a God? Why should I listen to him? And I would say that question has a really important answer. I would also say it's a question that even if you answered that there is a God, and that you should listen to him. It's one that you are answering every single day with your mindset, your attitudes, the posture of your soul, the choices that you make. Who is the Lord? So we're going to read actually today just verses 1 to 5, but I'm just going to start with verse 1 as we get to this interaction. Up to this point, and this is back from November, so if you don't remember all these details, I understand. But Moses, being born, shows up on the scene. The children of Israel are enslaved. And Moses tries to step in and see what he can do about it. He feels like he's been called for a moment like this, and so he's going to help his people overcome. His people reject him, and he's in danger, and he runs away. And he's away for 40 years. Now, I say those words, and we read that in the Bible, and it goes by like that. It's, a little paragraph or two. But think about 40 years. That's some weight in there, right? Anybody here waited 40 years on a prayer? I mean, what's your endurance limit before you just say, well, clearly God said no? Right? I mean, 4 years is well past mine, let alone 40 years. And I don't know that Moses is still praying and hoping. I think he's given up hope. And then God shows up on a mountainside. He says, Moses, I got stuff for you to do. And it's exactly the stuff you always thought you'd be doing, but in a whole different way. You're a lot older. You're a lot more convinced of your weakness, and I'm going to use you. And Moses spends a chapter and more saying, not me. Please, not me. Anybody but me. And in the last interaction with God before God finally sends him off, he says, Lord, please send someone else. And then we find Moses on this journey, picking up his brother along the way, interacting with his wife, and making his way back to Egypt. And here he is at Egypt. He's interacted with the children of Israel. They've embraced him. And now, for the first time, we find Moses and Aaron in front of Pharaoh to do the mission for which they were sent. So chapter 5, verse 1 says this, afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. That may be familiar to you, the let my people go part, but notice the other part as well, that they may hold a festival to you in the wilderness. Moses shows up in front of Pharaoh, and he delivers this message from God. First thing he does is he identifies who the Lord is. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The way that he says it gives the impression that Moses is expecting Pharaoh to understand the God of Israel is somebody you need to listen to. As a matter of fact, he uses the name Lord, the name that God had given him. This is my name. This is who you should say to the children of Israel has sent you with a message, the Lord. And that your word we sing in songs sometimes, transliteration into English is Yahweh. You might have heard it as Jehovah, which is kind of an older way of transliterating that, but Yahweh is a little more up to date with our scholarship and whatever. So that word means the one who is, with the implication of the one who is self-existent, the only one who is self-existent. You might think that you are independent because we're all Americans, so of course we all own our lives and do whatever we want because we're Americans. But there's only one who is truly independent, who needs no one else, who depends on no one else and relies on no one else, who does what he wants because he has the power to do whatever he desires, and that is God, the self-existent one. And this one is the one Moses comes to Pharaoh to say, God has said to you to do something. And so he says to Pharaoh in a way that there is a true and living God, more than what you think of when you think of gods, Pharaoh. And this God has got instruction for you because this God, the true and living God, has the right to give direction. Now, when we say who is the Lord, let me ask you, children of God, does God have the right to give you instruction? How are we responding to that? We say yes. If he has the right to do it, if he has the right to tell us what to do, why don't we do it? Why are there so many things that we pick and choose and say yes and no to? See, Moses shows up to Pharaoh and says, God is the self-existent one, and he's got instructions for you. God is not asking you, God is instructing you, let my people go. God is the one with that kind of authority in our lives. Maybe the problem is we don't really know who he is. Maybe if I were able to tell you who he is, maybe if I was able to give you a better picture of who God is, you would more readily embrace and follow whatever he says. I think that's the picture when Jesus uses the picture in the New Testament of the kingdom of God, and the king is this idea of someone that we, by reflex, obey. Because we become convinced that he's right, that he has the authority, and that he's good, and that our best path is following him. Today, the question in front of us, who is the Lord? Is he someone you should follow? Is he someone you want to follow? Or should you be in charge of your own life? And that's where the problem is. The problem is, I believe God's right, and I believe God's in charge, and I believe he has the right to tell me what to do, but I would like little vacations where I'm in charge, and I can do what I want. And I would like to be the one who decides when they are. Right? Like Sunday morning, clearly, God, you're in charge, and I'll worship you, and I'm Sunday morning, Christian me, yay. Monday morning, I'm at work, and I know how to deal with this. God, you just hold on a second. I'm going to take care of this. Right? Wednesday afternoon, I'm at school and all this is going on, and God, you don't understand, and you don't know what it's like because this school scenario and this social group, and you don't know, I'm going to have to take care, I'm going to have to step into this. You see? Is God the one who is right and we should follow him or not? This crossroads is with us every day, asking us if we really believe God is right and good, or if we are better off following our own heart, our own understanding. If you believe God has the right to say what should happen, look at what he does. He says to Pharaoh, let my people go that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. He says to them, let my people go for a little bit. Let us go out and hold a festival. The implication is that we'll come back after we're done having a festival in the wilderness. Now, what is up with that? We know that this story leads to the deliverance of Israel, that they are delivered from slavery, that they walk out of the land of Egypt into, eventually, years later, the promised land. Some people believe that this is God acknowledging protocol, or the kind of way that it would fit with Moses, who's going before a powerful man, is a little bit insecure. The standard way of making a request to a king was to not over-ask, not to ask for all of it. You asked for a little thing, you gave him the chance to say yes or no to the little thing as a sign of respect. You recognize that I don't have the power, you have the power. And so some people believe that God is kind of interacting with Moses here in a way that doesn't unnecessarily trip up Pharaoh, that asks for a small request before moving along to a bigger one. Other people go, well, God clearly is just lying to try to trick Pharaoh. He's just saying, well, we're just going to go away for a little while. Ha ha, we're gone. Right? But doesn't that beg the question, who is the Lord? Is God a liar? See, when I read Scripture, I come with an understanding of God, the way that he's revealed himself to me. And so I look through this not with those kind of questions, because I don't know exactly why God came this way. There is another possibility, that God is offering to Pharaoh a reality that never came to pass. A reality where Pharaoh and the story of the children of Israel is different than what we read in Scripture if Pharaoh had responded differently. That might sound far-fetched, but actually back in the book of Genesis, we saw several times where world leaders responded to God's call, and God dealt with them gently and graciously. Later on, in the minor prophets, we see in the book of Jonah, God sends Jonah to a city that is godless, and they respond when God sends word to them, and God deals with them graciously and kindly. So it may well be that there's a whole other storyline possible. We don't know why God gave this smaller request. But if we know who God is, we can identify with the moment here where God says, listen, this is what you're going to do. This is the right thing to do. And the choice is put in front of Pharaoh. Choose it or don't choose it. Does God do that with you? All the time, right? Here's what you should do. It's a little voice in your ear as you're driving down the road and that person is driving stupid in front of you. And suddenly you hear this thing in your head. Maybe it's a worship song we sang on Sunday, or maybe it's a little reminder that love is patient and kind and and you're like, volume down. You know what I mean? God invites us to his way. And God invites Pharaoh to his way. But he doesn't make him choose it. He doesn't force him. He gives Pharaoh a choice. Legitimately a choice. And a choice even to say no, which is exactly what Pharaoh says. If you were an Israelite, Moses and Aaron show up, we've got a message from God. The God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob has said, he's coming to set us free. And you're like, awesome, finally. Someone with more power than Pharaoh is going to tell Pharaoh to let us go. That's going to solve it. Except it doesn't, does it? As a matter of fact, when we get done this part today and we look into next week, it gets worse. Much, much worse for them, not better. Why is that? It's because God has this thing that sometimes is awesome for us because we get to do what we want, and sometimes it's so irritating because we want him to just pound somebody. Who is the Lord? Does the fact that he offers people a choice make him weak, uninterested, that he's given up? Does he not care that much? Who is the Lord? Pharaoh responds, because the next verse shifts over to Pharaoh in verse 2, and Pharaoh says, who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. Who is the Lord? He's not my God. In fact, I'm my God. I mean, I have other gods, but ultimately, I'm the king, and I am glad to be the king because I will make the call. God won't make the call, I will make the call. Here's the thing, you don't even need to be a king in order for you to have the same mindset that Pharaoh has. In other words, you have been given by God a choice in your life, choices in your life, and that can make you feel like you're the king over you. God has invited you into his kingdom where he's in charge of your life, where you are surrendered and submitted to him, where he has the say over your finances and your relationships and your sexuality and like everything. But he gives you a choice. And you go, ooh, choice. I like that. Choice puts me in charge. I'll be the king. I like that. So Pharaoh says, who is the Lord? This God that you are putting in front of me, I don't know him and I do not accept him. Like everyone who believes that they are better off with themselves in charge, Pharaoh pushes back at what Moses said God told him. I don't know why we are always so baffled by this, but let's just be real. People who don't know the Lord don't see any reason to listen to him. I think if the church could grab a hold of that, we could have a lot better relationships with people who aren't saved. People who don't know the Lord don't understand why they should follow him. Does that make sense to you? We're like, well, you shouldn't this and you shouldn't that, and why are you doing this? Because they don't know the Lord. If they knew who he was, then they would respond like they knew who he was. But right now, God just seems like an unwelcome intruder into their lives. And they say, well, why should I listen to you? Why should I listen to God? I don't know. I don't even know that he's real. Are you just making him up so you can tell me what to do? Is your God real? Is your God strong enough that I should care? These are the questions that Pharaoh is infusing into his response. They come to the same conclusion often that Pharaoh does. I refuse to acknowledge God's right to tell me what to do. Those who do not know the Lord will always respond in their blindness because they are blind. Sometimes I feel like the church is trying to make blind people act like they see, thinking that we've solved something. The answer is not for us to tell them where all the holes are so that they can avoid all the holes. Our answer is to tell them that they could see if they would meet the one who would give them sight. And see, knowing who the Lord is the answer to all of those questions. And I feel like we get sidetracked when the world comes to us and says, well, what does your God say? And then we tell them what our God says, and they're like, we reject that. Well, no, duh. Of course you reject that. You don't know him. See? So I'm not going to engage in arguments with the world about stuff that you can only know when you see. You can only know when you know him. And if you don't know him, well, then you won't know. But I hope you get to know him because he's changed my life. He's given me life. He raised me from the dead. I mean, I hope you get to know him. But it's your choice. He offers it to everyone. You see, people who are blind should not surprise us that they act like they're blind. Our prayer is that the Lord will help them see, will turn on the lights, because if they understand who he is, then they will see why they should embrace what he says. That's often my prayer on Sunday morning. Lord, show us you. Because I believe if we, the people of God, could stop being so distracted by everything else and could get our eyes on the Lord and could really see him, it would fix so much of what we've got messed up in our lives. Not for everybody else, for me. All of that despair and exhaustion and stressed outness and overwhelmedness and everything. If I could see him, it would address that. So my prayer is that you would know him better. It's the prayer that Paul prays in Ephesians 1 as we go through this on Wednesday night. I pray that you would know him better. I pray that you would have a better view of who God is, because when you know him, the other prayer he prays in chapter 3 is, then you start to understand that God is able to do more than we could ask or more than we could even imagine. In other words, when you start to know God, what you start to know is that God is better than you could even dream up. So it almost invites you, like, I dare you. Think about how good God could be. Imagine, as good as you can imagine he would be. Yeah, he's better than that, way better than that. Out of the ballpark, better than that. But think about it, and then he's better. See? I pray that we would know him. Interestingly, Pharaoh asked the question, who is the Lord? The rest of this story is God's answer. The rest of the story of the plagues and the destruction of his army and the parting of the Red Sea and all that is God's answer of who is the Lord and why should you obey him. I'm telling you today, if you will come to God and say, God, show me who you are, God will show you. Whether you come with an open heart or a rebellious heart, God will show you who he is. And you will have the choice to embrace it or reject it. You will have the opportunity to respond. And so we learn some things about knowing God. Knowing God is understanding that he has the right to say what should happen, that he is right. And when we know him like that, it causes us to say, tell me what the right way is so I can know and I can follow. Knowing God is not trying to shape him into something that we want or someone that we understand. It is embracing the fact that he is who he is, and he is revealing himself to us. And our limitations will always mean that there is more for us to know about who God is. So Pharaoh says, who is the Lord? Moses tries to answer, and Pharaoh gives his answer. Verse 3, then they said, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with plagues or with the sword. But the king of Egypt said, Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work. Then Pharaoh said, look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you are stopping them from working. In this explanation, again, we find Moses giving Pharaoh an invitation to opt out of what's coming. A gracious and gentle one. He says, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. He's real. We've spoken to him. We know who he is, and we're relaying to you who he is. Please do what he says, because if you don't, God is able to strike us with plagues or with the sword. Does that sound like a warning to you? Sometimes when you say, God, show me who you are, before he gives you the full, every bit of it, of all the fallout, of all your choices in life, he gives you a warning. Some of you have blown through a bunch of warning signs already. And you're on the way to finding out who God is in a way that you'll wish you hadn't found out who God is. You'll wish you had listened before this. You think when Pharaoh was holding the lifeless body of his firstborn son that he wished he had listened to Moses back then? I think so. Some of us have lived blowing through the warnings that come from the gracious hand of God. Moses says this is serious. God has the power to bring plagues. God has the power to bring foreign armies if we don't listen to him. And so let's not take this lightly. But Pharaoh, he doesn't see the reality of God's power. What he sees is, if you guys leave, things aren't going to get done that I need you to do. You're my slaves. Things are not going to move along like I'd like them to move along. I don't want you to waste my time anymore with all of these stories about God. Do what I can see, what I can feel, what's right in front of me. Do what I understand. Do what I tell you to do. Show that I'm in power again. Reassure me that I'm in charge again. The king of Egypt says, why are you taking people away from their labor? Get back to your work. He says essentially, why would you ask me to lose what is valuable for a fairy tale? Why would you ask me to let go of something that matters, something that is of worth, for stuff that's not? Except he's exactly wrong. He is entirely wrong, and so often we are too. Think about it. How many times have you ignored stuff you know God says and substituted your own judgment in there instead? We do the same thing. We look at Pharaoh and like, how could you be so hard? The question here in the story is not how could Pharaoh be so hard? The question is, do you see yourself here? And do you take instruction from it that says, if even I can look at Pharaoh and say you should have responded differently, does it tell me I should respond differently? Most of the time, we substitute in our own judgment because we believe that what we see is valuable. What we want is desirable. And what we would do on our own is better than what God would do if we followed him. Most of the time, who is the Lord drives that rationale. Admittedly, sometimes it's very hard to let go of what we see. Things are really big or really hard or really loud, and it's hard to move past that to trust and faith. Like when we suffer, when we lose somebody that we love, when we can't see how it possibly could be good to set aside what we understand or what we want. But those questions are how we get lost. Those questions are the fog. The question that drives us through and gives us clarity is, who is the Lord? Pharaoh chooses to reject this warning and this offer. He says, look, the people of the land are numerous. Get back to work. In this passage, we have two ideas of who God is. Two perspectives at odds with one another. One says, God will prevail, even when it doesn't look like it right away. This was valuable for the Israelites and for Moses and Aaron as well. Maybe they had ideas that if we just had the courage to walk in and say to Pharaoh, let my people go, Pharaoh would go, okay. I mean, after all, God was the one who sent them. Maybe they would think, all right. Except that's not what happens. A view of who God is something that is convinced that God will come through, that God will be faithful, that God's way will be good, even if it doesn't look like it right now. It's one view of who God is. The other view of who God is the way that Pharaoh comes. And he says, God has no right, God has no power to tell me what I should do or what is right. You have the same choice every day that Pharaoh had, that the Israelites had. What's the difference? The difference is what comes from it. The difference is we live with the consequences of our response to God. Because we live out our response of how we answer the question, who is the Lord? Moses answered it. God is worth the risk of returning to Egypt. God is worth the risk of showing up in Pharaoh's court with my brother, passing on messages that will seem ridiculous if God doesn't do what he said he would do. Pharaoh answered it. God is no one of importance, and God will not stop me. I will be my own God. I will be my own king. I will go my own way. Question for us is simply this. How will you answer this question today? How will you answer this question this week? Will you let God show you who he is? Because God knows the ways that you need to see him, the parts of him that you need to understand that you've been all wrong about, that have gotten you off the rails. How will you answer this question? Will you stay stuck in a small view of God? Or will you allow God to show you who he is? Today I want us to ask, who is the Lord? And let God be the one to answer it for us.